Welcome everyone to the fall 2021 edition of the Housing, Equity, and Community Series. I'm Shane Phillips. I'm the Housing Initiative Project Manager for the Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies, and I will be moderating our panel today. Our topic this time is evictions and rent relief in the context of COVID-19. And our emphasis is really going to be on lessons learned and how we can come out of this stronger than where we started. I'm going to give each of our guests a more detailed introduction in a few minutes, but just to quickly introduce them here at the top, we have Francisco Duenas from the Housing Now Coalition, Stephanie Klasky-Gamer from LA Family Housing, Ann Sewell from the City of Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department, and Kyami Wenger from Inner City Law Center. The next slide. As a land grant institution, we at UCLA acknowledge the Gabrielino Tongva peoples as the traditional land caretakers of Tovaangar, and we pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging. Next slide. The HEC, Housing, Equity, and Community Series, is put on 3 times a year, each academic quarter, by the UCLA Lewis Center for Regional Policy Studies and our partners at the Ziman Center for Real Estate. I would encourage everyone in our audience to sign up for both centers' mailing lists to stay in the loop for when we host events like this and when we publish new research. So I think we can get into a bit more context here, but I would like to invite our panelists to turn their cameras on now. And as I talk, you can just nod sagely or shake your head sternly if you disagree. So this event, in part, is about how we can do better in the future. But before we get there, I do want to acknowledge that the pandemic is not over, and I don't want us to lose sight of that. California has been relatively successful with vaccination and suppressing the virus over the past 6 months or so. But as a state, we have lost over 70,000 people to COVID-19 since 2020. And even now in California, an average of nearly 100 people per day die from COVID or COVID-related complications. Other parts of the country are doing much worse than that even. On top of these health impacts, millions of people have lost jobs or income, either short-term or long-term, during the course of the pandemic. And the impacts to jobs and income are ongoing for many households. So we're focusing today on lessons learned because we feel like it's an important conversation and it deserves more attention, but that shouldn't be interpreted as dismissing the ongoing health and economic impacts that so many Californians are still being affected by. So as I'm sure most of our audience is aware, as a matter of policy, we have had a patchwork of eviction protections and moratoriums dating back to March 2020 at the city level, county, state, and national level. And those have protected many millions of households from losing their housing during the pandemic. Many people received unemployment payments to help them weather the economic shocks that accompanied COVID-19. And most households also received a few stimulus checks during that time. Of course, not everyone has been eligible, with undocumented residents in particular being largely ineligible for many of these public programs and benefits, though not all. And over the past year, we've also had rent relief funded mostly by the federal government, but also some local programs. But it has been the case that the money has been slow to roll out to those who need it, although I do believe that is improving. Just for a little more of a local perspective and some research that we've done at the Lewis Center and Ziman Center recently, the Lewis Center and USC commissioned 2 surveys of LA County renters during the pandemic, one in 2020 and another in 2021. And to give credit where due, we received support for those surveys from the California Community Foundation, the Luskin Institute on Inequality and Democracy, the Luskin School of Public Affairs, the Ziman Center, and the USC Lusk Center for Real Estate. So just to summarize some of those findings very quickly, the researchers found that by mid-2021, more than 30% of renter households in LA County that were surveyed had been unable to pay rent, at least in part, for at least 1 month during the pandemic. And that was almost double the share who reported the same in mid-2020, just a year earlier. And unsurprisingly, things look quite a bit worse for low-income renter households than middle or upper income ones. By that second survey in 2021, 25% of renters reported being threatened with eviction, and 18% reported having an eviction filed against them. A quarter of renters had also used credit cards or emergency loans or other, kind of emergency sources of funding to help pay for rent. Using data from the US Census Pulse Survey, the National Health Equity Atlas estimates that California households owe about $2.6 billion in back rent. But the 2021 survey that we commissioned suggests upward of $3 billion in rent debt in LA County alone. So we don't know exactly where that stands, but just to give a little background there. Reported back rent was also not distributed equally across racial and ethnic groups. It was higher as a percentage of household income for Black and Asian households than white or Latino households. And on the landlord side, these are more national figures, but surveys in 2019 and 2020 found a sharp uptick in landlords deferring maintenance on their properties and missing a payment on their mortgage, utilities, or property taxes. And a surprisingly large share of landlords, especially smaller landlords, were unaware of the rent relief programs available to them and their tenants. So moving into this, against that backdrop, the state eviction moratorium in California ended at the end of September. Landlords can take their tenants to court, but tenants do still have protections against eviction in some circumstances, including if they're waiting on rent relief. And our panelists here know a lot more about this than I do. So if I misstate anything, please come back to this when you're introduced and let me know what I got wrong. But on top of those protections, both LA County and the city of LA do still have moratoriums of their own in place, but not all moratoriums are created equal, as we'll discuss. So the expiration of the state moratorium does put more of the onus on tenants to defend themselves in court, rather than automatically presuming that they can't be evicted. Many evictions were filed during the pandemic, and at least some of them are now able to be heard in court. So last bit I have to say before we introduce everyone more fully, I want to be very, very clear that I'm speaking about some flaws here, but these eviction moratoriums and the ongoing rent relief are very, very important. But they were a confusing patchwork, and they were hard to keep straight, even for those of us who work on this stuff for a living. So what we're going to spend our time on today is where those policies did succeed and where they fell short, from an institutional level all the way down to individual households, and see if we can't identify some opportunities to do better in the future, whether that's in preparation for some emergency that comes up in the future again, or just to ensure that we have a more dignified and equitable housing market generally. Okay, time to move on to our panelists and have a conversation here. We're going to go one at a time. I'm going to introduce you and share a quick bio, and then ask you to respond to the following question, and then we'll move on to the next speaker. So for that question, I'd like to start us off by grounding us in the experience of LA area renters, specifically through these lenses of the eviction moratorium or moratoriums and rent relief. Whoever it is that you represent or see as your constituents or service population, I'm curious to hear your reflections on who has benefited from these programs and how, and who maybe has been left out or not served quite so well. And you're also invited to share a bit of background about the work that you and your organization does as you share those reflections on these programs. So I'm going to start at sort of the bottom, at the individual tenant level. Bottom is not the word I meant to use there. This is a very important role. And I'm going to start with Kyami Wenger, and then we're going to move up to sort of larger constituencies with Stephanie, then Anne, then Francisco. So starting with Kyami. Kyami is a tenant rights attorney at the Inner City Law Center. He's worked as a tenant rights attorney there since 2018, where he's represented hundreds of low-income Los Angeles County tenants in eviction cases. And he previously taught as a law professor at Thomas Jefferson School of Law in San Diego. Kyami, welcome.
Thank you. It's great to be here. Thanks for
yeah, and so I'll just, sorry about that. I'll restate my question really quick because I know there's a lot there. I'm just curious, who you saw as benefiting from these programs, the moratorium and the rent relief, and kind of what that's looked like and maybe who's been left behind. And again, feel free to share a little bit about the work that you do more generally as well.
Thank you. So what I do is represent through the Shriver program and Stay Housed LA program. There's the Shriver program and Stay Housed LA programs assign low-income tenants to a set of nonprofits, including mine. So it's sort of like a public defender job. At any point in time, I have a couple of dozen cases that are open. We saw a lot of the effects of these moratoriums. It's been confusing because there have been multiple moratorium events, so to speak, but they have affected tenants differently. Going back to the start of the pandemic, the first and in a lot of ways the most powerful moratorium was Emergency Rule 1, which was passed by the Judicial Council at the start of April 2020. The Judicial Council is a set of judges whose job is basically to direct traffic around courts to make sure that cases are happening efficiently. Recognizing the potential effects of the pandemic, they put a freeze on almost all new eviction cases from April 2020 through September 2020, unless health and safety were required. Emergency Rule 1 cut new filings by over 90%. So it didn't matter what type of case, if it was a non-payment case, a lease violation, a nuisance case, a no-fault owner move-in, everything's on pause unless required for health and safety. Also, Emergency Rule 1 was the only moratorium which was self-enforcing. That is, it happened at the court level. You didn't have to, as a tenant, file an answer or do any other sort of defense. It just happened. Emergency Rule 1 was rescinded at the start of September 2020. And at that time, a set of state protections went into place. Also, the CDC order went into place at the start of September 2020. All of those are sort of patchworks that prevent certain types of cases from being enforced in certain ways, but they're all not self-enforcing. The overall effect of the set of moratoriums at the state level, federal level, county, and city has been in LA County, eviction cases cut by about 75% between September 2020 to the present. So these have not been as effective as Emergency Rule 1, but still they have significantly reduced the cases. The CDC order is the most broad. As interpreted by LA Superior Court judges, it prohibited lockout, which is when you look at an eviction case, there's the filing, there's a judgment, there is eventually lockout. LA Superior Court judges said that the CDC order, the specific language of it, didn't prevent a case from going forward, didn't prevent a landlord from getting a judgment, but did prevent the lockout. For a significant set of my clients, especially people who already had a judgment against them that we were trying to overturn through post-judgment motions, the CDC order was the most important protection. The CDC order was ultimately the last extension of it, was struck down by the US Supreme Court at the end of August of this past year. But the CDC order, extremely broad, not limited to certain types of cases, not limited to non-payment or whatever else. If the tenant signs a declaration with the 5 factors, including their income, the fact that they've been affected by COVID, then they're covered by the CDC order. It must be raised by the tenant. It's not self-enforcing. So I did see tenants who could have raised it and did not, and were locked out. That was one thing about the word moratorium that's been very frustrating, is that someone turns on the TV and sees moratorium on CBS News and they think, well, that means I can't get locked out. But people didn't understand or appreciate that they had to take certain actions. At the same time the CDC order went into effect, the first of 3 major state bills, which are AB 3088, SB 91, and AB 832, went into effect. These all had the major effect of the state level moratoriums was to prevent tenants from being evicted for non-payment for COVID rental debt. And this was a technical term. So if the eviction was based on alleged non-payment from February of 2020, it could still go forward. This moratorium doesn't affect it. But if it is based on alleged non-payment from April or May of 2020 or January 2021, then this moratorium comes into effect. It requires that the tenant turn in a declaration of COVID-related financial distress, and that creates these protections. There's several secondary effects. It basically shuttled most of this debt into small claims, and also created rent repayment, rent relief programs, which many of my clients have applied for, and we've gotten some of them, but there has been a little bit of a delay. But yeah, the major set of people who this moratorium protected are non-payment during the time period. Of course, what this means is that landlords suddenly discover 1,000 different lease violations. You have too many cars, you have pets, you're making too much noise, throwing too many parties. Cases that would have normally been filed as non-payment cases get filed as lease violation cases. Now, the County of LA and City of LA have their own moratoriums, both of which are still in effect. The county one, the latest version, expires at the end of January, and the city moratorium is a rolling moratorium based on the city level state of emergency. These provide a couple of additional features. They provide long periods of repayment for COVID rental debt. They prohibit different types of lease violations, but it's some subsets. So the county and city prohibit lease violation evictions based on extra occupants or based on pets. With the idea that, if your Uncle Bob has to move in with you because of the pandemic and he has to bring his cat with him, that we don't want that to be a cause for an eviction in Los Angeles. These are also not self-enforcing, must be raised by a tenant. They also prohibit most no-fault evictions, owner move-ins, for instance. So the end result of this it's been great in many ways. Tens of thousands of tenants have been protected. It's also been complicated. I literally had a client who said, I don't have to go to court. I saw on the news that all evictions are prohibited through the end of September. And I begged her to come to court, and she didn't. And she got herself locked out because she misunderstood the effects of these. So I hope that's a very short summary of a complicated set of laws, but that's been my experience with these.
That is why we started with you. You've got the whole picture of all the moratoriums. Could describe it better than I'm sure any of the rest of us. So we're going to move on to Stephanie now. And so Stephanie is the president and CEO of LA Family Housing. She has led, she's worked in this industry for nearly 30 years, social justice, economic justice work, and has an in-depth knowledge of housing policy, finance, and development. She leads this nationally recognized and award-winning organization.
You don't need to do it.
Okay, perfect. Well then, tell us about your experience.
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I think y'all care more about the issue rather than, our residents. But I will explain briefly who LA Family Housing is, because we are somewhat unique in our industry. LA Family Housing is both an affordable housing and supportive housing real estate development company, a nonprofit organization based here in LA, but we are also a large homeless service agency. And I say that because I'm not referring to providing services in our apartment buildings. I mean a standalone homeless service agency, from street outreach to housing navigation and stabilization services across the county, but rooted primarily in service planning area to San Fernando and San Gabriel valleys. So your question was, who are our constituents when we think about what was needed and who I feel benefited most? Is that accurate? What you want me to
Yes,
answer?
that's right. And anyone who struggled or you felt like should have been served but wasn't.
Right. So let me just first give a big picture of who our constituents are, because I would say they fall in 4 categories, particularly constituents that were affected by the eviction relief programs, the moratorium and the relief programs. So as an affordable housing developer, we are a developer, owner, and operator of what I call just low-income housing. Then we're a developer and operator. So our constituents are the tenants living in our low-income apartment buildings. It's 25 buildings, about 2,500 residents. Then we have tenants in our permanent supportive housing, of which there are 10 buildings in operation right now, representing about 60 residents. The third category as a homeless service provider are our participants. So we serve about 8,000 to 9,000 people a year who don't ever live in any of our buildings. So I would call them our constituents as well. And that's probably the population we help the most because we had more philanthropic dollars to serve that population in rent relief. But then, I'm not sure how to preface this. I was going to say, sadly, ironically, I would say our fourth constituent group are our own staff. So we're an agency of about 475 employees, the majority of whom are BIPOC, earning under $50,000 a year. These are direct service jobs, these are maintenance jobs, these are kitchen jobs. In some cases, they're entry-level case management jobs. And we probably had about 5 to 8% of our own staff in need of the same resources that we provide to our participants, which is the word we use for clients in our homeless services. And we made those resources available to our staff. In terms of who I think benefited the most, it would probably be, well, it's certainly our participants or clients of our homeless services, just because that's a much larger volume of people that we saw coming through the doors. And there are both public dollars and significant philanthropic dollars that we use as what we call flex funds that help in diversion from the homeless delivery system or homeless prevention or stabilization. You can kind of roll those all up into one. I think another question later was asking what the actual dollar amounts were, so I could talk about that later. Then the second population would be our tenants in our apartment buildings, in the low-income apartment buildings, but not in the permanent supportive housing. So they were not at risk of being evicted because we are their landlord, but they were at risk of not being able to pay their full rent. And that has significantly hurt us as a landlord. And I know that's a later question, so I can save detail on that. But the reason why our tenants in our permanent supportive housing are the least affected of our four groups is because the majority of that tenant population does not have stable income. And so the majority of their units, actually, I would say all of our permanent supportive housing units are already subsidized. So if they were at risk of paying, 30% of their income, whatever their income is, and it's recycling and not many people were out driving, and so they weren't picking up recycling, out on the streets, then the $100 that they may have paid, and they paid $80 instead, we didn't subsidize the difference because we're still receiving the full rent from whoever provided them with their rental subsidy. So I think that answered your questions. Who our constituents are and who benefited most or was dependent on the resources we had available.
Yeah, and it's a much wider group than I would have expected, which is really useful context. So Ann Sewell is next. Ann is the general manager of the City of Los Angeles Housing and Community Investment Department, responsible for direction and oversight of the city's programs for housing preservation, development, accessible housing production, community investment, rent stabilization, and code compliance, and has done many other things. And I will also speed up your bio here and let you speak. So again, who are your constituents here? You have a whole city to look after. And how have you seen them affected by this?
Great, thanks, Shane. And just so as of July 1, we are no longer the Housing and Community Investment Department. We are the Los Angeles Housing Department. We separated from the community services part that we had merged with 5 years ago. So there you go.
I was going to say it's back to retro.
The future, digging out the old hats and mugs. Realistically, our constituents are the 4 million people who live in the city of Los Angeles, focused particularly in this context on the 840,000 units, rental units, does not include single family homes, that the city is responsible for under our systematic code enforcement program, of which about 640,000 of them are rent stabilized units. So as was mentioned earlier, in April, and then clarified a little bit after late April, as part of the city's Safer at Home emergency declaration, there was an eviction moratorium that covers not only the rent stabilized units, covers all the rental units in the city. That basically rolls every month. Towards the end of the month, the council and mayor extend the Safer at Home emergency declaration, and we have now taken, after the end of September, with all the confusion about what applies to what. If you go to housing.lacity.org, there's a banner across the top that says, as of right now, this eviction moratorium extends for 12 months after this date, and it's whatever the last date was that the council renewed the emergency declaration. Under, I think it was AB 832, there is an end point after which even our grandfathered in local ordinance cannot extend beyond, which is, I believe, May of 2023. So it will not continue forever, but as long as the emergency conditions continue and the council renews it, that will apply. Basically, it did say that tenants, the rent is still due, but tenants had up to 12 months after the expiration of the emergency declaration to repay it, assuming that the ability to not pay was due to COVID-related reasons. There also, you can't have a owner occupancy for various reasons, or property manager occupancy for, I believe, 60 days after the expiration of the emergency declaration. And then there are other nuances that are best looked at in looking at the ordinance, or better yet, call up any of the Safer at Home legal services providers like Inner City Law Center, who will do a much more exact job, because people, no matter how many times you tell me or anybody else the rules, they're always so nuanced. People need to hear it over and over again. One of the things the city of LA did that I think really informed us, and we'll talk a little more, I think, about the emergency rental assistance programs, but as almost immediately in May of 2020, as soon as the pandemic was really sending everybody who wasn't an essential worker home, we decided to use $100 million of some of the COVID relief money for our local emergency rental assistance program, which had about 100,000 people apply. And we provided up to 2,000 per household that documented, really just attested to the fact that they couldn't pay rent due to COVID, which gave us a pretty good sense of what was going on in terms of people's, how many people were interested in rental assistance. It really followed a lot of what you mentioned, Shane, with the Lewis Center's survey, but gave us a little, we were able to look at income bands, people making less than 30% of median income, people making less than 50, and to see how that was affecting folks. One of the things we realized right off the bat that speaks to the confusion is, just because you live in, Huntington Beach doesn't mean you don't think Eric Garcetti is your mayor. So, we got 110,000 applications, and about 20,000 of them were people who weren't in the city of LA, and not just like right next to the city of LA, but the greater Southern California area. So it's really confusing when you tell people that the county or the city, ordinances apply to you, because they're not really sure what, people go by neighborhoods. Is Van Nuys in the city? Is it not? Yes, right. It is, by the way. I think we did the second emergency rental assistance program with federal money, and there's all sorts of lessons to learn about that we can talk about a little later. But, I would say that right now our interest is very much in continuing to protect tenants. And also, the whole rent stabilization ordinance premise is that, we are there to protect tenants, but also to provide a fair deal for landlords. And the average RSO landlord owns 5 units. We are not talking about huge apartment owners. Out of those 640,000, the average owns 5 units. So this has been a very challenging and difficult time for them. Within days of the stay-at-home orders, the three, the Office of Thrift Supervision and, the Federal Reserve and others announced a sort of a, mortgage relief program for landlords, and the payment protection or the paycheck protection program was out there. But a lot of landlords have been kind of making it without any of those, assists, and it's been a hard time. So we're, interested in really the great thing about the emergency rental assistance program was the ability to kind of, help tenants and get everybody paid. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. And our last person to be introduced here is Francisco Duenas. He's the Executive Director for Housing Now, a California statewide housing justice advocacy coalition. Previously, he was the Housing Justice Campaigns Director for the Alliance of Californians for Community Empowerment, a position which had him actually serving as the lead coordinator for Housing Now since May of 2018. Francisco, welcome. And again, just big picture question, tell us a little bit about your work and also just who you see as your members, constituents, clients, however you describe them.
Thank you so much, Shane. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, wonderful. I don't like these headphones, so these are not my favorite, so I have to check in. So thank you for having me here, inviting me. Our coalition, we're a big tent coalition, so we have many different types of groups within our coalition, but they're all focused on and centered around protecting low-income communities of color with respect to the impact of our affordability crisis and our displacement crisis in California. So we have some community groups that are, organized by communities, neighborhoods. We have some unions. We have some policy groups, like actually Inner City Law Center, who's a great partner. And we bring folks together across the state. So the thing that I would add to our, conversation, or, from my vantage point, are some of the, the background that was happening in the Capitol, I would say, and that brought us all of these various different policies. As kyami started off, there have been several iterations of some type of eviction preventions. And then at the same time, starting, I think maybe, what Anne mentioned locally, but at the state level, it was only after the, maybe January when we first were confirmed that there were going to be federal funds available for emergency rental assistance. Then there was sort of a pairing of rental assistance availability across the state with that eviction protections, and sort of trying to ramp up the emergency protections, even as in some ways they were trying to diminish the eviction protections with every successive bill. But I think from my vantage point, having both our coalition advocates at the state level for policies, and we weren't prepared for a pandemic, and so when this started happening, many of our coalition groups said, we need to do something about this. And so bringing folks together and trying to identify where is the immediate action that's needed, I think was sort of the first wave and the first step. I think many in our group's coalition partners, some were calling for what some European countries did for a certain portion of the time, which is they just sort of forgave the debt that tenants had, canceled the rent, and then they provided a separate fund for landlords to be applying for funds, and in some ways sort of disconnected what the tenant was on the hook for from what the landlord could then apply for, right? In order to sort of not continue to impact tenants in this particular exceptional case. We've gotten, as folks have mentioned, some policies that have really mitigated the harms to tenants. But I would say, as kyami pointed out, both in terms of the eviction protections, but then also in terms of the emergency rental assistance itself, folks who are immigrants across California, folks who have less access to digital, to broadband or to internet, or even know how to navigate the internet, have find it harder to both access information, access the rental assistance, and also probably have in other challenges about, like, do they have a place, do they keep the lease that they have? A lot of people don't have a copy of their previous lease somewhere around to show as proof. So those are all just general built-in, I would say, challenges that when it came time to provide this support, made it already harder. The things I will say as well, sort of again from the sort of statewide lens, there were other proposals out there to actually, previously, before we had federal guarantee funds, there was a policy put out there by the California Apartment Owners Association for landlords to only receive 80% of what they were owed. And with the federal funds, with the federal guarantees, effectively now landlords, assuming everybody applies that is eligible, should be getting 100% of their rent, that is owed to them. So I do think that it's important to distinguish. But similarly, I think as some tenants have found it hard to apply, have so many things going on, the same thing is true for some landlords, right? Corporate landlords have made some money during this pandemic as well, and they have actually used that money to purchase more properties. Also, the federal mortgage relief, because of the pandemic that Anne mentioned earlier, covers those mortgages that are backed by like FHA loans, or Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, sort of about, I think, 75% of mortgages in California. And our coalition was also trying to expand that to cover the remaining 25% of landlords who don't have a federally backed mortgage. And, the banks actually would not go for that. The credit unions actually stepped in. And so not all landlords themselves were able to take advantage of some of those mortgage, foreclosure prevention efforts. And so I would say that there is sort of a difference between some of the larger corporate landlords and the smaller mom and pop landlords as well. So those are just, I'll leave it there for some big picture vantage point. The last thing I will say is, because so much of the workings of our democracy in Sacramento were closed effectively at different points in time, a lot of these decisions, initially through executive decisions or executive orders or through the judicial council, but then eventually when the legislature opened up again, so much of these decisions were dependent on whether we're going to get federal funds. And because of that, a lot of things were just really kind of left up to what in Sacramento are called the big three: the governor, the Senate president, and the speaker of the assembly. And so I feel like there was less opportunity to go through the regular process of democracy in Sacramento. There wasn't sort of the bills that we're talking about were finalized at the last minute, usually right before a deadline. And that was very hard, both for tenants and landlords alike, in terms of, not having certainty about what would come next, but also for advocates, not being able to sort of go through the regular process to be able to provide feedback and input about the way these programs could work most effectively.
That's a very good transition. Thank you. I wanted to spend some time, both on the eviction moratorium stuff and the rent relief. We've talked a little bit about the challenges, and I don't want to move past that just yet, but I do want to also start to think about, well, how could we do things better? Could we have done some of these things better? So, I know we're all on the same page. The eviction moratoriums were a good thing. We're also, I think, all on the same page that they weren't perfect and could have been better. And so one thing that Francisco, you just brought up is the uncertainty, where tenants are facing, 3 days away, their eviction moratorium is about to expire and it ends up being extended. But what is that experience like of not knowing? There's just the communication aspect of all of this, of how do you get the word that Kyami in particular talked about, get the word out to people about what protections they actually have. So all of these kinds of things, I'll just invite everyone, and I'll actually start with Kyami because I know you have some to say about this, but what have we not kind of covered yet in terms of the challenges that we're faced? And then, where do you actually think we could have done better? Because I think that's really the challenge. It's pretty clear why we ended up with a lot of the challenges we have. I think it's less clear what we can do or what systems we can put in place to make sure that we don't run into similar problems in a future scenario that looks, at least broadly similar to this one.
Thanks. Yeah, I still see a lot of cases. I mean, evictions down 75% means 25% of them are still going forward. I'm seeing a lot of defaults. And one thing that is frustrating as a tenant right advocate is that people get a letter in the mail saying your eviction case has a hearing on September 5th, and they think I don't have to go because there's a moratorium, and they get defaulted. And then we go in for a set-aside motion. I mean, and then on the set-aside law, you've got to show mistake or excusable neglect, these legal standards. It would be really nice if we could just have a broad rule saying, if this case shouldn't have been filed to begin with, because landlords are still filing. I'm still getting no-fault evictions in LA County filed, and they're just betting that the tenant isn't going to respond. If I respond, then we get the case thrown out on a motion for judgment on the pleadings. But if the tenant doesn't respond, they get defaulted. The deadlines are super fast under CCP 1167. You've got to file your answer within 5 days, and then the landlord can get a trial date within 20 days. You can get defaulted. If you got served on the 1st, you could have a default and a lockout by the 30th of the month if you didn't answer. And that's really fast. So it would be helpful from a tenant side perspective to be able to say, the courts need to look at the notice and say, wait, is this a notice that's even allowed to happen? Because whether the tenant responds or not, you shouldn't be defaulting somebody for extra occupants in LA County, because that's in theory prohibited under the moratorium.
And just to interject quickly, I feel like at a higher level, I mean, this is very specific to the pandemic in some respects, but it sounds like my understanding of how eviction court works generally, which is very poor understanding, is it's very sort of landlord friendly, or just kind of like whoever knows what they're doing friendly, which tends to be the landlord in any circumstance. And so all of these rules that kind of default in favor of the person who has at least some legal knowledge, may be unavoidable to some extent, but it does seem like certainly this is part of the argument, I think, in favor of right to counsel.
Absolutely.
But somehow making it so that you're not relying on people to, study up on all this stuff, sometimes with 5 days notice, and somehow know exactly what they have to do to protect themselves against eviction. Exactly. And that's something that could continue, that perhaps should be a policy just generally, not specific to the pandemic.
Absolutely. And then to build briefly on what Francisco was saying about rental relief applications, I understand that they need anti-fraud provisions, because otherwise it could say, my wife rents the bedroom to me for $1 million a month. Please give me $1 million a month to rent my own bedroom from my wife. And I understand, but for especially low-income clients, especially tenants who work with mom and pop, you end up with people who don't have written leases, who don't get receipts, who pay in cash, and then the folks asking for the rental relief are like, give me documentation. I need a W-9. I need the lease. I need the grant deed. I need all this evidence. And for many of my clients, it's difficult to put together the sort of evidence that is being asked for. And then the other thing that we've had trouble with is just that these applications just drop into a black hole. And then the judge says, are you guys going to settle? And I say, well, we've applied for $20,000 in rent relief. We applied a month and a half ago. And the judge says, what's the status of it? And I say, we applied a month and a half ago. We don't have an update. And that's been the status in a half dozen of my cases. And I sort of beg the judge, let's get another continuance. Let's see if this rent relief comes through. But there hasn't been, at least from my clients, there hasn't been a lot of good communication about whether they're going to get the rent relief, when they're going to get it. And the landlord is saying, I want that money. So that has been an issue with the rent relief. Some of my clients have gotten rent relief, which is great. I don't have a clue as to why some of them got rent relief within weeks and others have been waiting for 3 months to hear back.
Sorry about that. So we're already at 12:47, so I want to make sure we continue through this. But if anyone has anything to add on eviction, we're going to get to rent relief and a few kind of targeted questions here. But does anyone else have anything they want to talk about? You're very welcome to do so on the eviction moratorium, kind of shortcomings and potential improvements.
Shane, if I could just add two additional points to
Yeah.
Kyami's comments. One is what's called self-eviction, which is a lot of times also people just move when their landlord tells them, hey, I'm going to evict you. People think, well, I don't have money for a lawyer. I don't know what to do there. And they just move because they hear that, getting an eviction on their record is a bad thing. And so, and that's not counted in any of the eviction court data or things like that. So we don't know how many people, maybe it'll show up in the ERAP, in the emergency rental assistance, data, but a lot of people just move. So that's one dynamic that's also out there. And I think we could be better about taking into account. And then the second thing is enforcement. With some of these state bill laws that, during the pandemic, we have increased the violation for, the penalties on landlords who illegally lock out their landlords. But I would say that the enforcement of those laws, even the enforcement of current laws previous to these pandemics around harassment or around illegal lockout, it's rare that we have any enforcement of them. And so I do think you have seen, I think Cal Matters has done a great job of covering this, the number of evictions that happened during the pandemic in California, even with, mostly through illegal lockout, even with the various protections in place. So just wanted to add those 2 points.
Yeah, those are great. And we actually had one of our HEC events from, I think it was actually 2 years ago. And it was really on the subject of enforcement. And we tend to put a lot of emphasis on the policies that will protect people and instituting new protections or strengthening them. And when it comes to the actual enforcement of them, we tend to not pay as much attention. And it's really, really important, especially for this kind of thing. And I saw you had unmuted earlier. Did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, I think the one thing that is clear is that the issue of your eviction is ending tomorrow and the moratorium is ending tomorrow and you could be evicted. I think the one thing that the city did that was helpful is to state that there is a certain payback period. So even because I think we can all remember back to the spring of 2020, the idea was, well, it's going to be bad for a couple of months and then magically we'll all be back to work. And and we know what happened. People went back to work, they stopped going back to work, all sorts of things. It just keeps, cycling. So it was confusing, and that confusion went through, all of the eviction stuff. So having that extra long runway is helpful for people, I think.
Yeah, and I do think that uncertainty, the uncertainty of the moratoriums and these protections was sort of a consequence, at least in part, of the uncertainty of the pandemic itself. And so I think that is important to acknowledge. Stephanie, I wanted to ask you, we sort of hinted at it in your introduction here, but you as the developer are also the landlord once it's done. And so I'm curious if you could just share a little bit more about your experience from that side of things, managing things. And maybe, if you have any peers who are more on the regular affordable housing or even the private side, what experiences you've heard from the landlord perspective.
Yeah, so just for LA Family Housing, as I shared before, our portfolio is really split between our affordable housing and our supportive housing. Our supportive housing, we didn't see any impact. Our affordable housing, we did. We are so far calculating a loss just under $200,000, which is real significant to us. These buildings do not throw off any cash for their operations. They are all revenue neutral, meaning the rents that we receive, in some cases, barely cover the operating costs, but they're supposed to cover the operating costs. So that $190,000 has to come from someplace because it's keeping utilities on, it's keeping property management staff on site, et cetera. From our own affordable housing portfolio, we had about 34 households that applied for assistance. Only 19 received it. And they received about, or we received about $65,000 from them. So I think the numbers someone else said ranging between like $2,000 and $3,000 being the annual, I mean, the average subsidy that households were receiving, that's consistent with what we've seen. You know, this morning I was on a call with our board of directors real estate committee, and one of my board members is Tony Salazar from the national real estate development firm, McCormick, Barron Salazar. And when we were talking about this in part of our asset management report, the loss of revenue for us as a landlord and how we were making it up, honestly, it's just fundraising. That's the only way we can make it up. There is no other revenue to cover those costs, and they're not, they're fixed costs. I can't not turn the utilities on in these buildings. Anyway, Tony was sharing that in all 26 markets where they are developing and they operate multifamily housing across the country, every single market is experiencing it. So it's not, you know, just in Los Angeles. And every market, he says, there is some form of assistance. He doesn't know, you know, the strength of it or not, but he's seeing similar type losses. I have not checked with my nonprofit affordable, Tony McCormick Barron Salazar is a for-profit affordable housing developer. From my nonprofit colleagues here in the LA area, I'm sorry, I did not get a chance to check in. Anne might know a little bit better how our colleagues are doing. I do know that with some of our properties do have loans with the city's housing department that are being, you know, we are getting letters, please pay us, but we don't have the funds to pay. So, so Anne might be able to speak to that. On kind of the positive side, you were really asking this question, particularly as a landlord, but I do want to also share some numbers because clients that might otherwise, or might also be a client of Inner City Law Center, et cetera, or your colleagues, since mid-2020, we have helped 65 households with homeless prevention on an average closer to $4,000 per household. And we have paid about $180,000 in rent arrears for another 75 households. Close to, I don't know, I can't do my math fast enough, but in that 2,000-ish range per household. So, but those are clients of our homeless services who are living in buildings, not our own, who, you know, the homeless prevention isn't always rent arrears. Homeless prevention might be, I can't pay my utility bill or my car payment or get my car repaired. It's either that or rent. And so we do, you know, the homeless prevention dollars. The homeless prevention dollars have primarily been coming out of typical homeless dollars that we get from the county, and the rent arrears have come out of philanthropic dollars.
Got it. And
how are my colleagues doing?
yeah, hear about that.
And I will say, LA Family Housing, sorry, Anne, to cut you off. LA Family Housing has a different portfolio than the majority of my colleagues. For better or worse, we have a very small portfolio. We've got the 4-unit, the 8-unit, the 10-unit. We have a number of, you know, 50-unit buildings, but we've got easily 10, 12 properties of our affordable housing that are under 20 units. they are clearly hurting the most because they are so dependent. They don't always break even in a good year. And so under a pandemic, they're doing far worse. My colleagues tend to build larger properties as one should.
Yeah, like I think the tenants for a lot of the affordable housing projects are exactly the essential workers that we, watched go through, exposure to the pandemic and then job loss or, whatever. So in the first few months, again, it very much reflected what Shane said about the Lewis, study. First few months, we were watching most of the nonprofit affordable housing developers who had been reporting 95%, debt collection or rent collection, which is pretty good, because people move in and out. And so 95% pretty much is 100%. And then they were down to like 90%, which is going to hurt, but not, terribly. That was in maybe the first 6 to 8 months. In the last, as this has stretched on into 18 months, that number has significantly climbed, I think, just as it did with the, the non-assisted housing apartments. But still, it's not, because tenants usually didn't start out paying 60% of their income for rent or 50% of their income for rent. It's not as, it took longer for the impact to be seen.
I only see a few in the Q&A right now, and I did still want to get to talking about rent relief specifically, despite our limited time. But just to think about rent relief, sort of the same question as the eviction moratoriums, like where have been the pinch points? Where does it feel like things are not working? And what can we learn from that? What should we be doing in the future to make sure these kinds of things work better? I feel like the same problems that happened with rent relief, we also saw with distribution of unemployment, for example. So there seems to be kind of core sort of bureaucracy issues involved and lots of other things. So anyone's welcome to answer this. Please do be concise, and we'll try to spread it around a little bit.
Big picture, if that's okay. So
yeah.
I mentioned the city had done essentially an unregulated rent relief program at the end of 2020. We had our $100 million and we just put it out there, and it went pretty fast. We got $100 million out to 50,000 households in 6 months, and we had 50,000 households left on the wait list that we weren't able to assist. So when the first ERAP money came out, with accompanying webinars by the Treasury that basically said, fraud, waste, mismanagement, and we are coming after you if you don't make sure that, this money goes to the right people in the right way. We knew that we had 50,000 people worth of unmet need and a whole bunch more people. And we knew that, the first tranche of money was about 250 million. So we opened, the gates with more rules than last time. You had to document things, et cetera. And we also, there's really two application processes. There's the tenant and then there's the landlord. And if you're trying to catch fraud, one of the things you look at is where they don't agree, and they never agree. Tenants never say that they owe the same amount of rent that the landlord thinks that they owe, and so on and so forth. So, and we also knew that we were not going to have anywhere near enough money. So we specifically sorted people into everybody earning less than 30%, then everybody earning less than 50%. And we never even really got to the sorting of the under 80%. We got over $550 million in requests in 6 weeks for the 250 million. And we closed the window because it just seemed like asking people to jump through hoops and to have, hope that we would be able to get to them when we wouldn't. And that was part of the confusion. And started slogging through, first the tenant, then the landlord. And then as things were slow around the country and Treasury started saying, just throw the money out the window. We really don't care. We will clean this up later on. We were basically trying to change the behavior of our subcontractors, some of whom were legal services providers, and telling them to throw the money out the window is just, anathema to their souls. So we were trying to deal with that. One of the things that we did that I am most proud of, not only did we get a whole bunch of money out to the 30% people. We've now spent everything from our 250 million. But as we began to realize that we didn't have anywhere near enough to cover who was going to come in when we reopened it, we went to the state of California and said, so what happens if we give you our 250 million from the second tranche and something like 1.2 billion worth of requests come in, which is what has happened. You know, the city of LA alone in unmet need from September 1 has applied for 1.2 billion, and all we give the state was 250 million. And what they told us is under, 832, we have the obligation to just keep processing and keep rolling along. So we will sort of adjust as things come in as long as we still have money. We are basically at a point now where the state is envisioning being out of money, and we are, really trying to push for the Treasury and others to reallocate from other states that aren't using it. And so that's, it really speaks to me about Los Angeles is a lot poorer and more rent burdened than any other part of the state, and really probably of the country. So hopefully we got a lot more people assistance than we could have with our 250 million, but the transition, was confusing for some people, because even though we told them we're never going to get to you, people still think, but I'm in the queue, so someday you're going to get to me.
Yeah, and I can see the intersection of the urgency of the eviction issues and needing to get the money out being a really difficult challenge too. Just you can't take forever, because it's not, people can't wait forever because the expiration of the eviction moratorium, and even if they're technically protected, they don't always actually do the things they need to stay in their home. So is there anyone else on the rent relief? I'm sure we have more to say on this part of things.
Shane, if the other thing, Anne gave a quick recap of what it looked like in Los Angeles. Across the state, it varied a lot. So you had some cities and counties that already had programs like LA, and that were just, were able to, use the money that the Fed was giving them into their own program. Some were just building a new program from the ground up, and or partnering with a nonprofit. And we have seen beyond, just that bureaucratic, challenges that you were talking about really snowball for those cities and counties that were not ready for this. And some have been able to, partner with the state, others less so effectively. And so I do think one of the things we're working on with Policy Link is to try and come up with a map about where the estimated need is, and correlate where the applications are coming from, so that we can identify parts of the state where either people don't know about the program, because a lot of people didn't even hear about the program until the state didn't start sort of their media push until October the 1st. And then other folks just don't know where to apply, even if they have heard about it. So just wanted to add that as well. Across the state, it has been all over the place.
I've seen, especially in the low-income communities that I serve, I'll tell people what the current status is, but I also talked to community organizers, and we play a sort of game of telephone where I tell somebody from LA Tenants Union or from ACE, okay, applications are now open, but they go tell somebody, but by the time it goes through 2 or 3 levels of telephone, applications have closed, and then I say now they're closed, and then they're open again. So that has, I think, and I don't know if there's a good way around it. I understand why applications have opened and closed and opened, because money being available and then running out and then being available again. But it is definitely probably 75% of my clientele is monolingual Spanish speaking. And there's a great deal of confusion among them about when applications are open and whether they're open.
Sorry, I wanted to, Stephanie, if you had anything to add, please feel free. There was a clarifying question that Elaine L had asked about what you meant about rent relief efforts and programs serving the unhoused population. I'm guessing it's sort of like, maybe there was a misunderstanding there that these are people who are formerly unhoused but are currently living in your supportive housing. Is that correct?
No.
Okay.
Sorry. As a homeless service provider, yes, we primarily work with unhoused individuals and households, but we also work with people at risk of homelessness. So somebody who has been stably housed, they still work with our housing stabilization team. Because as we know, it is not always just having the roof over your head. It's ensuring that you are remaining stable and successful in that housing. So for example, we had one tenant, this isn't COVID related, but just how how housing stabilization teams work and our caseworkers, how they support our participants who are actually in housing, but we want to ensure they stay there. We showed up at somebody's apartment one day. She's been in this apartment for 4 years, walked in the door, and Miss Shalimar is sort of spilled out on the ground with all this paper all around her. And I was job shadowing that day, and I see out of the corner of my eye, like 6 feet tall bags of recycling sitting on the porch, and that the lights are off, and that the pantry and the refrigerator looks like it's all emptied on the kitchen table. And me, not being a social worker, not being, I don't know, calm, I want to like solve everything and ask what's going on with everything. But my social worker, who I was just learning what she does, she just said, Miss Shalimar, what's that one piece of paper by your left knee? Like, let's do one thing at a time. And what unraveled and we learned was that her car broke down and she didn't have $750 to repair it. And she needed her car to deliver her recyclables, and she depended on the income from her recycling to pay her electrical bill. And so she didn't pay her electrical bill, so everything spoiled and was out on the table. And because of that, she had critters. And because of that, she got an eviction notice for $750. So yes, we serve a lot of people who might technically have housing, a roof over their head, but we continue to support them that they remain stable in that housing. And that's how our stabilization team and our eviction team or prevention team work together so that we could pay that $750 to repair her car and then turn the lights back on and then keep her apartment.
Yeah.
Hope that clarified.
Yeah, that is very helpful. And I mean, it reminds me of something that I've heard about, which is this problem of you can be eligible for rent relief, but only for back rent. And so if you took out an emergency loan or borrowed money from family or what have you, or didn't pay another bill in order to pay for your rent, you don't have back rent. And so you might not be eligible. And so the narrowness of the program and what it considers to be eligible and not is a really important factor in this too.
And I actually want to add one thing. One of the barriers that we saw in being able to support some of the tenants in our own buildings. So as I said, about 34 applied, only 19 received support. We turned to our own prevention dollars that are meant in our homeless services to try and help the tenants in our apartment buildings. But in order to receive that support from this pot over here, you did need to be enrolled in homeless prevention. And it was really hard to communicate to our tenants in our own buildings why they needed to sign this paperwork to enroll in homeless services when they don't consider themselves homeless and they got nervous. Did that mean I was homeless? So I think Francisco had mentioned it before, just some of the barriers of language, a lot of the barriers of technology were in play and why people weren't able to access resources that were meant for them.
Yeah, and Francisco did have to leave for anyone who missed his message, but we appreciate his participation here. So we have just a few more minutes, and with 3 people left and 4 minutes to go, I feel like we can give everyone a minute to maybe just tell us, what did we not do during this period that you wish we had done, or just what is something that came about as a result of the pandemic? Mostly focused on this eviction protection and relief that you would like to see continue. Either one of those is fine. You can start with Well, whoever wants to start, in case you got something on the tip of your tongue.
I'll just say that remote court for me has been great. I don't have to dress up in a suit and I can dial in. For many of my clients, has been extremely difficult. If we could just create broadband available for everybody and distribute, laptops are not, especially compared to all of the amounts of relief, laptops are not expensive.
Kyami, could you move just a little closer? I feel like the audio is cutting out a little bit.
Yeah, so I think especially for my clients, some internet access and a laptop would be huge in helping give them access to the courts. Because for lawyers, remote court has been great. I don't have to dress up. I don't have to go downtown. But for my clients, it has been an extra burden. And also they need to solve the interpreter issues, which are difficult in remote court when everything has to be interpreted by a court interpreter and the court interpreter has to talk to the client. And then that has been it's been very messy. So for my low-income Spanish-speaking clients, remote court is a nightmare. And I think we need to solve that.
That's one I haven't heard really anything about. And it seems like remote court could be a blessing, right? Like it could actually make it a lot more accessible so people don't have to go to court to, to not be in default, basically. But we're not there yet. Anne or Stephanie?
Yeah, I would echo that, but I would also say that one thing we learned from the emergency rent program is that 85% of applicants who were under 30% of median income applied successfully and fairly, expeditiously online. So there's that 15% that needed assistance, through the hotline or something like that. But I think the whole ability to move online is growing, and we just need to always make sure that we provide both. That for me, the lesson across everything, whether it's eviction defense or emergency rental assistance or whatever, is really that the people need help. Understanding the rules, understanding how to fill out applications, and that help is expensive. When it came to the city, we have 500 million roughly to put into this program across the two things. We could have taken something like 10 or 15% and put it into admin, for the people who were writing the checks or whatever, but also into assisting, engaging with groups like Inner City Law to help people. And the trade-off for us there was, we know we're so short of actual emergency rental assistance. How do you balance that? So we never hit the 15%. We went way below that. And yet one of the benefits from the state is they had 5 billion. So even if they only took 5%, it was still enough to have a more robust helper group that I think is really important in all of this. So being able to do both, would be amazingly helpful.
Stephanie?
I think I'd take a bit of what both of you just said. Definitely 100%. The first thing that we jumped into at LA Family Housing was getting laptops and hotspots to all of our interim housing sites. I mean, that and food was the very first thing in the first couple of weeks of the shutdown. I would say in the first week of the shutdown, because by the second week of the shutdown, we were opening up 4 Project Room Key sites. So totally different issue, but there was some, immediacy, because there was some urgency that came about because it was a pandemic and we did do things differently and the resources were there to do things differently. I think what we need to learn from it is that urgency for our housing instability across LA is just something we need to remain constant. We can't wait for a pandemic to do the kind of creative solutions that we did this past year and a half.
I think that is a great place to end. Anne just had to drop off as well, so we're losing our participants here. Before we go, I just want to thank all of our audience members for joining today, the Lewis Center and the Ziman Center both for hosting and helping organize this event, and especially our panelists for sharing their time and expertise with us. Thank you, Anne and Francisco, who have departed, and Stephanie and Kyami, who are still here for this great conversation. And we will see everyone at the next Housing, Equity, and Community Series event in the winter quarter. Thank you.
Thanks much for including us.
Thank you.